Chapter 33. Hope and Loss. Life is not measured by the number of breaths we take, but by the moments that take our breath away. Hilary Cooper. David stood at the gravesite, clutching Tina's hand. She had returned from Kansas City with Penelope and Kip when she had heard the news. She was 14 now, and she had grown nearly as tall as her brother. She stood quietly by his side, her long fingers clutching a bouquet of flowers. The masses of people gathered around the gravesite were a testament to the mark left on so many. In their loss, and everyone had lost so many in the past 10 years, the grief had not lessened at the passing of someone so intrinsically a part of the community. Nearby, another grave had been dug, but no one paid any attention to it or cared. It already had a body lowered into it, been filled, but there was no marker. It wouldn't take long, perhaps a few years at most, for the wound in the soil to become grass, and then no one, not a single person, would remember that he was buried there. And that was for the best. On David's left side stood Tina, and on his right was Jess. Her arm was heavily bandaged, and her neck bore livid bruises, the sharp outlines of fingers now smudged in red and purple. Her left eye was black, and her cheeks still swollen. Despite her appearance, Jess felt stronger than she had ever thought possible. That night, as Scott Cooper's hands had closed around her throat, she had held his knife tightly in her hands. The nightmares, filled with darkness and fear and hands groping her, touching her body, using her, those nightmares had resolved into one clear and focused thought. This man before her had to die. Despite his strong grip on her already bruised throat, despite the screams of her son as he struggled to stop the man he shared a genetic heritage with, she had kept that one thought firmly in mind. She hadn't panicked. The knife had slid in, softer, easier than she had expected. Scott Cooper had looked surprised and rather shocked. She remembered to use a sideways motion, a quick slice to the left and to the right, severing arteries, intestines, spilling waste inside the abdomen, ensuring a horrible, elongated, and certain death. As if in slow motion, her hands had fallen away, his body angled backwards, slowly as if time had reduced itself to a crawl, especially for them, in this moment. She fell with him. Together, Jess and Cooper connected with the floor, Cooper's knife between them, slamming into the carpet, the knife finding his spine beneath. This close to him, she could feel his heartbeat, strong at first, but slowing as his life drained away. Cooper's face wore surprise, a look of mild alarm, and he stared as Jess slowly pulled away, Jacob frantically searching her for wounds, asking if she was hurt. His voice was muted compared to the dull roaring in her ears. All she could do was stare into Cooper's eyes, locked in that moment. She would not look away until it was over. There was so much blood. It was black in the weak moonlight, warm and wet, bathing them both in a pool of it. It wasn't her blood, though, at least not the majority of it. She let Jacob wrap the blanket around her once again, never breaking eye contact with the man on the floor. Jess stared at the monster from her dreams, bleeding out, his body disjointed and slack, a puzzled look on his face. There was a pounding at the door, and Jess could hear David, her brother, and others. The door crashed open, and people poured inside, militia members, her brother and David, everyone heavily armed. The moment, though, stood suspended, like a mosquito in amber, a fish frozen in ice. She stared into Cooper's eyes, ignoring the sounds around her, the shouts of the others as they moved into the house and found the old man's body. She ignored David asking her if she was all right. Nothing else mattered in that moment. Cooper stared back at her, his eyes slowly glazing over. She stood there, unmoving, unresponsive, until she saw the life leave him. The eyes are the windows to the soul. She had heard that once. She waited until the lights turned off for the very last time. Only then had she allowed David and the others to lead her away. Now, standing at Thurman Banks's graveside, she felt a strange sort of bittersweet peace. The old man had been Cooper's last victim, and he was mourned, not just by her little family but by most of the town. There were people all around her, and their low murmurs saturated the air, reminding Jess that even in death, life goes on. The pastor had given a short speech, and now it was her turn as the town historian. She stepped forward, out of David's protective embrace, unfolded a piece of paper and began to speak. I shared many moments with Mr. Banks over the years. The first 2 years after we returned, he made sure we stayed fed. He shared his harvests with us, the meat and eggs from his chickens, and his knowledge. He was the grandfather I never had. She paused and felt the emotion swell up inside her. Last year, he asked me if I could write down his story, and I of course told him that I would. And here it is. Thurman Banks was born on a hot September day in 1946. Hours later, after the grave had been filled and the tears had been dried, the dark beauty of the late summer night stole over them. The cicadas hummed noisily, their rhythm rising and falling in a cadence known only to them. The house was full, but everyone inside was preternaturally quiet. Jess felt as if everyone was hovering around her, nervous and watchful. Jacob and David had maintained a regular, almost obsessive presence around her, barely leaving her side at all in the past 2 days. She could feel them watching her now as she pecked at her food, not really seeing it, the vision of Cooper's death replaying in her mind. David's hand on hers. Jess, are you okay? She returned to the kitchen, looked around and saw all those who she loved. David, Jacob, Becca, and Aaron, along with Tina, Penelope, and her husband, Kip, Chris, and Carrie. There was concern written on many of their faces, held quietly in their eyes as they stared back at her. Jess felt her mouth tug and reshape, lips curving into a huge grin. Yeah, she said simply. I'm okay, I really am. She took David's hand in hers. We are going to have a baby. The room erupted with surprise and excitement. Outside, the cicadas sang.